Russia's war in Ukraine. Ukrainian properties in Crimea, including Zelensky's, to be sold, Russian-installed officials announce. From CNN's Maria Kostenko and Neav Kennedy. Russian-installed officials have announced their plans to sell a raft of Ukrainian-owned properties in annexed Crimea, including a property owned by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. In a post on Telegram, chairman of the State Council of the Republic of Crimea Vladimir Konstantinov announced plans to sell 100 nationalized properties. These are residential premises, including the apartment of the Zelensky couple, sanatorium and resort facilities, retail and commercial facilities, Konstantinov said on Saturday. The Russian-installed authorities expect to raise over 800 million rubles, $8.2 million, from the sale of the properties, according to Konstantinov. 8 auctions have been already carried out in Crimea, Konstantinov said, adding that concluded sale and purchase agreements reached the value of 815 million rubles, $8.4 million. Konstantinov, who is the Speaker of the Crimean Parliament, said a specially designated commission will continue efforts to identify the property of Ukrainian oligarchs in Crimea. Some context: Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine in 2014. In recent weeks, Ukraine has refocused some of its war efforts on the region, increasing missile and drone strikes on Crimea in an attempt to land both strategic and symbolic blows against Russian forces. Russia likely boosting missile capacity to target Ukraine over winter, UK says. From CNN's Amarachi Ori. A police officer inspects the remains of a Russian cruise missile in Kyiv, Ukraine, on May 18. Valentin Ojarenko/Reuters. Russia is likely able to generate a significant stockpile of air-launched cruise missiles, ALCMs, and there is a realistic possibility that it will use them against Ukrainian infrastructure targets, the UK's Ministry of Defence said Saturday. Between October 2022 and March 2023, Russia focused long-range strikes against Ukraine's national energy infrastructure, the Defense Ministry said in the statement posted to X, formerly known as Twitter. Open-source reports suggest that since April 2023, ALCM expenditure rates have reduced, while Russian leaders have highlighted efforts to increase the rate of cruise missile production, the Defense Ministry said. It concluded, Russia is therefore likely able to generate a significant stockpile of ALCMs. There is a realistic possibility Russia will again focus these weapons against Ukrainian infrastructure targets over the winter. Some context: on Wednesday, Ukraine called for tougher and more sophisticated sanctions against Russia following reports that Russia had managed to overcome sanctions and export controls imposed by the West to increase its missile production. Last winter was cold and dark for many Ukrainians, with Russian forces launching hundreds of missiles and drones at Ukraine's energy infrastructure, seemingly with the aim of breaking the country's power grid, temporarily cutting off electricity, heat and water to millions. At one point last October, about 40% of normal electrical supply was offline in Ukraine, according to Ukraine's state power generator, Ukrenergo. EU cancels restrictive measures against Ukraine's agricultural exports. From CNN's Maria Knight. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed the European Commission's decision to cancel restrictive measures against Ukraine's agricultural exports in his nightly address on Friday. Restrictive measures against our agricultural exports by the European Union have been cancelled, Zelensky said. Now, it is important that European unity works on a bilateral level with the neighbors, he emphasized. The Ukrainian president said that a lengthy meeting with government officials and the office regarding further tactics in protecting Ukraine's agreements and free trade with the EU was held on Friday. The European Commission wrote in a statement that Ukraine has agreed to introduce any legal measures, including, for example, an export licensing system, within 30 days to avoid grain surges. Until then, Ukraine must put in place effective export control measures to prevent any market distortions in neighboring member states. Kyiv must submit an action plan to the European Commission's coordination platform no later than Monday, September 18, according to the European Commission. The European Commission will refrain from imposing any restrictions as long as the effective measures by Ukraine are in place and fully working, the statement read. On May 2, 2023, the EU adopted a temporary measure that banned wheat, maize, rapeseed, and sunflower seed originating in Ukraine from being exported to Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, after those countries raised concerns over local farmers being undercut by a bottleneck of cheap Ukrainian grain. In parallel, a coordination platform was set up in order to bring together these countries and develop infrastructure and increasing logistical capacity, as well as removing administrative barriers to the export of agricultural products from Ukraine, the statement concluded. Liberating Andriivka, necessary for further advancement in Bakhmut, Ukrainian commander says. From CNN's Maria Knight. A Ukrainian commander in the Bakhmut area has said that the liberation of the village of Andriivka on Friday is necessary for further advancement in Bakhmut. Maxim Zorin, deputy commander of the 3rd Assault Brigade, said on his Telegram channel that Andriivka is a necessary bridgehead for further advancement because the task of Ukrainian forces in this area is to surround Bakhmut, and without Andriivka it is impossible to achieve this. Zorin also noted that liberating Andriivka means a full control over the railroad, which is a stronghold for further offensive. Ukrainian President Zelensky congratulated the 3rd Assault Brigade and all involved in retaking Andriivka in his nightly address on Friday and called it a significant and much-needed result, noting that active battles continue around the villages of Klishchivka and Kadyamivka near Bakhmut in Donetsk region. Ukraine's General Staff noted that the defense forces have partial success in the area of Klishchivka in a daily update on Friday. Some context: Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade recaptured the village of Andriivka, south of the city of Bakhmut, on Friday, it announced on Telegram that day. They are now trying to consolidate their gain there to hold on to it. Bakhmut sits toward the northeast of the Donetsk region, about 13 miles from the Luhansk region, and has long been a target for Russian forces. Russian forces claimed control of Bakhmut in May following a months-long slog in the city. The Russian advance was bolstered by members of the Wagner mercenary group, which incurred heavy losses in the fierce fighting. Russia gives Kim Jong-un an inside look at its warplanes and frigates. From CNN's Yoon Seo in Seoul. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un inspected warplanes, toured an airfield and visited a Pacific Fleet frigate on Saturday as the latest stop on his tour of Russia took him to Vladivostok. Russian state media reported that Kim had met the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu at the Novichi airfield in Vladivostok before both men were accompanied by the Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Navy, Admiral Nikolai Evmenov, on a visit to the Pacific Fleet frigate Marshal Shaposhnikov. The North Korean leader was shown the ship's central command center and its modern missile weapon control systems, the Russian Ministry of Defense said via Telegram. The Russian Defense Ministry added that Admiral Evmenov had talked to Kim about the expanded capabilities of the new control systems, which allow Kaleb sea-based cruise missiles to be effectively used against sea and coastal targets at a distance of more than 1,500 kilometers from the ship. Afterwards, Kim was gifted a replica of the ship and left a comment in the frigate's guest book, though the ministry did not reveal what he wrote. The stop in Vladivostok is Kim's latest in a tour of Russia and its Far East region that follows his meeting with President Vladimir Putin earlier this week, at which the North Korean leader appeared to endorse Moscow's war on Ukraine. There has also been speculation Putin is seeking arms from North Korea for his invasion. U.S. National Security Advisor says G20 declaration was powerful despite stopping short of condemning Russia. From CNN's Donald Judd. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan defended the final declaration from last week's Group of 20 summit, which stopped short of explicitly condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Sullivan hasn't received any kind of formal, or really informal, reaction from Ukraine with respect to the G20 communiqué, he said at a briefing Friday. Rather, the National Security Advisor said, Ukraine remains focused on engaging with other countries at peace summits, like the ones held this summer in Denmark and Saudi Arabia, where leaders can find a way forward toward a common understanding of the principles upon which the just peace should be based. Sullivan said the conversations at those two summits actually bear a strong resemblance to the propositions laid out in the G20 communiqué. He listed the declaration's 4 key tenets in regard to Ukraine. First, the paramount centrality of territorial integrity and sovereignty. Second, the statement that it is totally unacceptable for any country to use force to violate the territorial integrity of another country. Third, that attacking grain infrastructure and civilian infrastructure should be totally off limits. And fourth, the threat or use of nuclear weapons in a conflict like this should be inadmissible. Sullivan pushed back against the idea that the communiqué was tepid in its support for Ukraine, saying those 4 propositions are powerful. Rather than statements of neutrality, he argued they really say to Russia, what you are doing is not acceptable. What Ukraine said after news of the declaration emerged, Ukraine's foreign ministry spokesperson Oleg Nikolenko said the G20 had nothing to be proud of. Ukraine is grateful to its partners who tried to include strong wording in the text, he wrote on Facebook. At the same time, the G20 has nothing to be proud of in the part about Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Obviously, the participation of the Ukrainian side would have allowed the participants to better understand the situation. The principle of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine remains as key as ever. 5 hours 5 minutes ago. Sullivan says he senses bipartisan support from congressional leaders for additional aid for Ukraine. From CNN's Donald Judd. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with Senate leadership last week and House leadership Thursday to discuss support for Ukraine. He told reporters on Friday that he got the sense there was backing for bipartisan support for Ukraine from leaders on both sides of the aisle, even as some House Republicans have signaled they may block additional aid. I've got to say, in those conversations, I felt the basic vibe, so to speak, the idea that the United States needs to come together on a bipartisan basis to support Ukraine felt as strong as it did a year ago, on both sides of the aisle, he said. Last week, CNN reported the White House was ramping up pressure on House Speaker Kevin McCarthy to approve its request to tie aid for Ukraine with increased disaster relief funding ahead of a government funding showdown. But tension among Republicans in Congress is mounting as lawmakers face an end-of-month deadline to avoid a government shutdown. The White House has called on Congress to pass a short-term spending bill to keep the government running while congressional leaders hash out major differences. Though Sullivan expressed optimism that there was an appetite for a bipartisan aid package, he admitted the dynamics have changed since Republicans took control of the House last year. I acknowledge that there's a difference between this Congress in the last Congress, and we'll have to contend with that as we go through the discussions that will continue in the days ahead on how to get Ukraine the resources it needs, he said. Still, he pointed to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to Washington and Capitol Hill next week as a sign there might be progress on Ukraine aid soon.